Major Nziogwu, can you please give me an account of the night of the coup in Kaduna?
Well, it's rather something like the longest day. Well, no, we didn't see him until the time we actually shot him. He ran away from his house when we fired the first few shots of anti-tank gun into the building. The whole roof was blown up and the place was set alight. Then we went to the rear of the house and started searching from room to room until we found him amongst the women and children, hiding himself. So we sort of took away the women and children and took him.
My main concern is to restore law and order as soon as possible.
One thing I know, though, that Lagos has been boasting about their ability to take ships into Lagos Harbor for quite a long time, but they have not been able to come into our territorial waters.
Do you think that it will be necessary to use military force to bring down Colonel Ojukwu's regime?
Yes, it is necessary. I think I have made this point before that if the integrity, corporate existence of this country is threatened, I will use force to maintain it. And I'm afraid the time has come.
It is generally agreed that the immediate causes of the Nigerian Civil War were the military coup d'etat of January 1966 and the subsequent counter-coup that followed it between July 29th and September 29th of the same year. As I have said in this previous chapter, those months were some of the darkest in the history of our country. The sporadic killings and the tension created by the unrest compelled some 50,000 Igbos to flee northern Nigeria for the eastern region by the end of July 1966. But the build-up to that painful situation began earlier. After the head of state, General Aguiyi Ironsi and Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi were abducted by rampaging soldiers in the early hours of July 29, 1966 in Ibadan and taken away, the country was literally without a government for about 3 days. Between July 29th and 31st, when their whereabouts were unaccounted for, an atmosphere of uncertainty enveloped the country. Brigadier Babafemi Ogundikpe, then the most senior military officer after Aguiyi Ironsi, and considered in certain quarters as the natural successor to him, made a broadcast on the afternoon of July 29, 1966, calling for the cooperation of the public in the government's effort to restore law and order in the country. In an attempt to further restore calm, Brigadier Ogundikpe sent Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon to the Ikeja cantonment to appeal to the group of headstrong northern officers led by Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed, Majors Shitu Alao, Musa Usman, and Captain Joe Garba, who were spoiling for a fight and even toying with the idea of a succession. Those efforts didn't yield results. Then, after a series of behind-the-scenes negotiations brokered by such top civil servants as Alhaji Sule Katagum, then chairman of the Federal Public Service Commission, Alhaji Ali Akilu, then head of the Northern Nigerian Civil Service, Chief Justice Sir Adetokunbo Ademola, and 2 foreign diplomats, the British High Commissioner Sir Francis Comyn Bruce and the American Ambassador Albert Matthews. With the adamant northern officers, a compromise was reached. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon emerged on Monday, October 1st, 1966 at 32, the new head of state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. A statement was subsequently issued stating that Gowon had been chosen to be the commander-in-chief by most of the Supreme Council members. The emergence of Lieutenant Colonel Gowon as the new commander-in-chief of the Nigerian Armed Forces marked the beginning of the tension between Gowon and Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Odumegu Ojukwu. In an early morning broadcast from Enugu, Ojukwu rejected Gowon's emergence as head of state, insisting that in the absence of Aguiyi Ironsi, the most senior Nigerian army officer, in the person of Brigadier Babafemi Ogundikpe, should be head of state and commander-in-chief. The state of national tension increased. Eager to restore confidence in the country, Lieutenant Colonel Gowon assembled regional politicians dubbed leaders of thought to fashion a way forward for the country. Then he turned his attention to the military, making a few tactical changes. Those changes were detailed enough to affect younger officers like me. In early August, I was transferred from the A Squadron Reconnaissance Unit in Kaduna to the B Squadron in Abeokuta. Similar tactical changes took place in various other divisions. But Gowon went further. In a move that turned out to be a political masterstroke, in August he released the leader of the Yorubas, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, from Calabar prison, where he was serving a prison sentence for treason and secured in the process the much-needed support of the Yorubas at the time. Unfortunately, Gowon's commitments to the Igbos that their lives were safe in northern Nigeria were unfulfilled. Almost simultaneously with the deliberations of the leaders of thought taking place in Lagos, perhaps the most horrific killings of Igbos occurred in different parts of northern Nigeria on September 29, 1966. The killings were frightening. A deluge of refugees swamped eastern Nigeria from practically all parts of Nigeria. Faced with this intolerable situation, through a reconciliation conference between Ojukwu and the federal government. That intervention, seen as the last chance to prevent an all-out war, led to the famous peace conference in the southern regional town of Ghana, Aburi, between January 4th and 5th, 1967. That conference between the Eastern Nigerian delegation led by Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu and the federal delegation led by Lieutenant Colonel Gowon resulted in the famous Aburi Accord. In the absence of fully published records for the federal government regarding what transpired at the Aburi meetings, the details of what happened have remained speculative. While the published accounts of the Eastern Nigerian delegation insisted that an agreement for a loose Nigerian federation was agreed to, the federal government claimed that the government reached an understood and seen within the framework of a united Nigerian state. The one area of agreement on both sides was that force was not to be used to settle the Nigerian crisis. In response to the Aburi Accord, the federal government promulgated Decree 8, which was meant to embody the accord as understood by the federal government. At a meeting of the Supreme Military Council in Benin on March 10, 1967, where Decree 8 was being ratified by the military governors, Ojukwu boycotted the talks, claiming that the decree violated the spirit and the meaning of the Aburi Accord. These differences in interpretation were the final trigger for the outbreak of the Nigerian Civil War. I had arrived at the war front only days after Nsukka had fallen. Those early days were tough. Clearly, the Nigerian army needed more time to be fully ready for war. Apart from a few peacekeeping operations at home and abroad, the Congo crisis, Tiv riots, etc., the Nigerian army's experience of war on an operational scale was limited. In addition, the 1966 coup and counter-coup had depleted the army of several of its Sanos-trained graduates. Indeed, as of the end of July 1966, fewer than 10 officers holding the rank of Lieutenant Colonel were still alive and on duty. Faced with the shortage of experienced officers, we had no choice but to rely on the support of non-commissioned officers, NCOs, some of whom may have had combat experience from World War II but were unfamiliar with more modern weaponry. My own experience tells the story of those difficult early days. Although a trained armored officer, I was assigned an infantry role as commander of the 44 Infantry Battalion, also known as the Rangers, when I took over from Lieutenant David Ichogu. While I was acutely aware of the functions of armored and infantry officers overlap in such places as troop training, the evaluation of operational situations, and the promotion of morale and combat efficiency, I also quickly came to terms with the fact that as a young 25-year-old commander of my new battalion, my role was different. As an infantry commander, I knew I had to lead attacks and execute offensive and defensive maneuvers. My operative words were to lead. I knew this, albeit in theory, but now I was saddled with that function in practice. It was necessary, particularly at the inception of the Civil War, to lead by example. And this is a point that needs to be emphasized here. We had a few ex-servicemen who were unable to handle sophisticated weapons, but we needed to retrain them to blend in with more current rules of engagement. However, in retraining them, we needed to prove that we could handle the weapons we were asking them to take and face the enemy as much as they could. We needed to inspire them and boost their morale. The soldiers wanted an officer who would say to them, "Follow me, let's go," and they would follow. No officer who lacked courage or conviction could be effective in the situation before us, particularly as the fighting men believed they were fighting for a just cause to keep the country united. But a curious twist of irony in the reality of the war adversely affected me. There I was, determined to fight to keep the country united, but I also knew that across from us on the other side were persons we had trained with, lived with, socialized with, and bonded with as comrades in arms, but who were now our enemies. It was painful, but I knew that it was a job that I had to do, that needed to be done. Before I settled down to the realities of combat, events degenerated very rapidly by early August. On August 9th, Biafran forces led by Lieutenant Colonel Victor Banjo, who by the way was the first Nigerian director of the Electrical and Mechanical Engineering Corps of the Nigerian Army, crossed their western border through the Niger River into Benin City. By August 21st, Biafran soldiers had reached Ore, in present-day Ondo State, a mere 210 kilometers away from Lagos. The Biafran military administrator of Benin even declared it the Republic of Benin. Not unexpectedly, the federal government's response to the invasion of Benin was swift. In a full-scale declaration of war, General Gowon put Colonel Murtala Mohammed in command of a newly formed 2nd Infantry Division, with a directive to expel the Biafrans from the Midwestern states, defend the border of the western states, and to attack Biafra. Although Nigerian troops retook Benin on September 22nd, the catastrophic attempt of the 2nd Infantry Division under Murtala Mohammed to cross the Niger River from Asaba to Onitsha on October 12, 1967 amounted perhaps to the highest loss of men and materials to the Nigerian side throughout the entire duration of the war. Barely days after the River Niger crossing debacle, the federal government launched another offensive south of Biafra from the Niger Delta using the Lagos Garrison Command under Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, the Black Scorpion, to form the 3rd Infantry Division, which was later renamed the 3rd Marine Commando. On October 17, 1967, aided by considerable firepower from Ilyushin IL-28 bombers flown by the Nigerian Air Force and amphibian forces of the 3rd Marine Commando, Calabar was invaded by Black Scorpion and his men. After 2 days of heavy fighting and losses, Calabar fell to the federal troops. It would be months before Port Harcourt fell on May 19, 1968. From our end in the 1st Infantry Division, the northern offensive continued from the Nsukka sector. In those weeks and months, I met several other officers of the Nigerian Army whose paths would cross with mine over a sustained period after the Civil War. These officers would include names like Major Abdullahi Sheleng, Lieutenant John Inyenge, 2nd Lieutenant Yohana Maraki, and 2nd Lieutenant Haliru Akilu, among others. But even more importantly, I soon confronted the brute realities of war and combat. War, any war, is horrifying and painful. While many films may depict real combat situations, a war situation isn't like the movies. There's nothing like the real thing. There's nothing like the macho myth that says you're not supposed to be scared during the battle. No matter the amount of training and preparations before combat, the shadow of death hangs over everything. As I quickly learned, the emotions that come with war are complex. Such feelings vary from just plain fear, anger, grief, guilt, hatred, anxiety, sadness, raw revenge, and sometimes jealousy and even love. And these were so evident during the Civil War. While it was difficult sometimes to contain the anger or bitterness of troops who, for instance, had just been ambushed by enemy fire and witnessed their colleagues killed, I have never forgotten the sense of camaraderie, duty, and brotherly love that came into play even in those moments of grief. The vast chunks of uncertainty and unpredictability between these emotions could determine so much in the blink of an eye. Let me attempt to illustrate these realities. In our attempt to capture Enugu after the fall of Nsukka, Lieutenant Colonel Theophilus Danjuma, who had only just relieved Sule Apollo of the command of the detachment of 1st Division at the Nsukka front, began the advance on Enugu on September 12, 1967. Colonel Danjuma's advance was a broad front of 7 battalions, 4th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, and the 82nd, with some 20,000 troops as reinforcements, to make it difficult for the Biafrans to pin us down. Just as we approached Agbani in today's Enugu state, we came under heavy attack from the Biafrans. The attack was so intense that we had to retreat. As I turned around, I could see from a distance that my childhood friend Captain Garba Duba had taken a hit. He was down bleeding and writhing in pain. You could see that he was in deep trouble. But the enemy fire was so intense that it would be foolhardy to move close to him, let alone attempt to save him. And then suddenly, as if consumed by a sudden release of adrenaline into my bloodstream, which may have also blinded my receptors to the dangers from the barrage of enemy fire around me, I impulsively crawled across the field and dragged Duba away towards us. We immediately pulled him out to the rear before he was airlifted to the hospital. This attempt to save Duba was one of my early close shaves with death during the war. Looking back now, I don't know why I did it. It was crazy. It was clear that the danger was enormous, and it was probable that if I hadn't done it, perhaps someone else would have stepped in to save Duba. But at that moment, what mattered the most was that we needed to evacuate him to safety. We needed to save his life. It was not about how leaving a wounded colleague behind could affect the troops' morale. While that may have driven me, I was convinced that my action, complicated as it seemed at the time, was a decent thing to do. One of the rules I wholeheartedly imbibe as a soldier and as an officer is this: as much as possible, never leave behind a wounded or even a dead colleague in a war situation. Yet some specific incidents in war are so frighteningly unpredictable that they render you hopeless and helpless. One morning during approach to Umuahia through Okigwe, I walked down a makeshift runway with my driver, Sani. Trained as a combatant, Sani was always eager to remind me that he was not an ordinary driver of jeep vehicles, but a real soldier. On this morning, Sani, anxious to show off with his rifle, which he carried across his shoulder in the standard patrol carry position, was in one of his bubblier moods as he walked 2 steps behind me. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, a stray bullet hit Sani and he dropped dead beside me. I was petrified and consumed with fear. 1 minute, Sani and I were engaged in a spirited exchange, and the next minute he was dead. It was a horrifying experience that I never recovered from throughout the war. Life has to have some more meaning, I thought to myself. Even as I write this, I can see Sani 54 years after, in his jaunty steps, his gaunt face enveloped in a weary smile as he struggled to catch up with me on that makeshift runway. With the fall of Enugu on October 4, 1967, Ojukwu relocated the Biafran capital to Umuahia, deep inside the heartland of Igbo territory, thus dousing the hope that Enugu's fall would signal the end of the succession. But there's a little anecdote about the capture of Enugu that deserves to be recalled. When federal and ground forces assaulted the city, Ojukwu was asleep in the State House. When he woke up to the sound of gunfire and explosions to find his guards gone, the building was surrounded by federal troops. Ojukwu was said to have disguised himself as a servant to escape the cordon. Had he been arrested, it is probable that the war might have ended earlier, saving millions of lives and destruction. Now the attention of federal troops shifted to Umuahia. After the first attempt to take Umuahia by the 3rd Marine Commando failed, Colonel Shua gave that task to Lieutenant Colonel Danjuma, who commenced the invasion of Umuahia just days before March 27, 1969. The attack would go on until April 24, 1969. As a major, I was commander of the 82 Battalion, one of the 7 battalions deployed by Lieutenant Colonel Danjuma to invade and capture Umuahia. But to get to Umuahia, we had to first go through Uzuakoli, a mere 13 kilometers away. On March 27th, we came under heavy bombardment from Biafran forces, but somehow we held our ground and bulldozed our way to the outskirts of Uzuakoli. Then under my command on April 1st, the 82nd Battalion attacked and captured Uzuakoli. But as it turned out, our victory came with severe costs. Now acutely aware that from our position in Uzuakoli, we were only a few kilometers away from Umuahia, the Biafran artillery began an uninterrupted bombardment of our positions. Not even our aggressive response to these attacks deterred them. It was during that fierce fighting that a Biafran Ogbonigwe shell wounded me. The shrapnel landed on the left side of my chest and came close. We would later found out to have affected my lung. I was fortunate. Initially, I wasn't aware that I had taken a hit, partly because of the intense and prolonged firefight. I never heard a shot or felt the impact. I smelled some burning human flesh. Alright, it was a bit of a burning sensation, but no more. In those brief seconds, the wound didn't hurt. Then suddenly, as I grabbed my chest and felt blood oozing out, I felt like a kick in the trunk had left me with a numb, throbbing pain. And then my feet started to gradually go numb, first above the knee, then below it. At that point, I think I fell and I had to be moved, and one of the other commanders, Maman Bata, took over the command of my battalion. My CASEVAC, casualty evacuation process, organized mainly by Colonel Dada, the same Dada who was head boy at Bida Secondary School before me, was slower than my colleagues would have wanted. It was getting past dusk, and since the available makeshift runway lacked takeoff and landing gears, an improvised runway had to be created from a convoy of military vehicles with their lights full on. Once that was done, I was promptly evacuated to the Lagos University Teaching Hospital, Idi-Araba, Lagos. Surprisingly, despite the throbbing pain, I remained alert and conscious from the moment I took the hits through the period of my evacuation. Even though I wasn't sure of the nature of my injury, my spirit was upbeat. While I didn't think I was about to die, I knew this would be a life-changing experience. Deep down inside me, I had lingering moments of fear. For instance, since I had learned somewhere that bullets could bounce, ricochet, and change trajectory once inside the body, I wondered where the bullet supposedly lodged somewhere around my chest area was located. As the Nigerian Air Force twin-turbo evacuation aircraft took off, or was it a Douglas DC-3 propeller aeroplane? I felt like closing my eyes because it felt so good. It was midnight when I was finally wheeled into the Teaching Hospital Lagos emergency ward. Waiting to receive me was a young professor of medicine, Adeyemo Elebute, who had only become, I later found out, a professor of surgery barely days before I arrived. A pleasant and amiable gentleman. Professor Elebute and his lovely wife, Dr. Oyinda Elebute, who would later become professor of physiology, took excellent care of me and provided me with the best medical care available. After tests showed where the shrapnel was lodged, Professor Elebute opted for surgery, but he backed off once he identified my mortal and dreaded fear of surgery. Ultimately, he recommended long bed rest for me, warning me that while the shrapnel would not kill me, it could pose a minor future challenge if I lived to be a grand old man. I still await that challenge as I navigate my twilight years. If you've watched up until this point, then chances are that you enjoy our content. So support us by giving us a like, subscribe, share, drop us a comment. Let us know your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video.